Hello, welcome back. Today I would like to make some observations in relation to a recent video made by Kraut and Tea titled "The Alt-Right is Too Dumb for Genetics and Maths," wherein he sets about debunking the alt-right's alternative hypothesis on race and their use of RK theory and so on. Now, I won't be defending the alt-right or their use of RK theory in this video. I would usually let such nonsense slide past, with little or no comment, but Kraut claimed to have elicited the help of two academics in the making of this effort, so it caught my interest. We have, it seems, a neurologist, geneticist, and Kraut engaged in this rather dire joint enterprise, which I think it's safe to say is a little over-seasoned and ill-considered. Now, I've not really had much preparation time, and some of the topics covered are complex in nature and more than a little contentious. But I've watched the video and made some notes on several issues, which I will address in the order in which they appear in the video. So, let's begin.
One common argument against race is that the experts recognize that race doesn't exist. So in essence, I don't believe in asking experts such as biologists to explain biology, but it is also worthwhile asking experts like biologists to explain biology. This is a fascinating statement, truly. But yeah, good. I guess the author of this article did as I did and sought out biologists to ask them for their opinions on the subject matter of race realism. And no, they did not. Anne Morning looked at the usage of race in 80 most commonly used high school biology textbooks from 1952 to 2002. While not as good as a survey of biologists, it gives us a rough indication of the trend in biology, which, unlike asking biologists to explain biology, literally is an appeal to authority fallacy. But anyway, the alternative hypothesis at least links to this study, so we can read it ourselves. Wait, this is just the homepage of the sociology department of the New York University. What does sociology have to do with classifications in biology? Okay, I am being admittedly a bit cheeky here. Bottom line, I couldn't find the original study. All I could find was a book by Anne Morning, which I didn't buy, since, as far as I have seen, it is purely sociological and has absolutely nothing to do with biology. But I remain charitable that this statistic is correct, that medical description of race has risen. So I did what the alternative hypothesis should have done. I asked a neurologist why the medical descriptions of race have risen in biology and medical textbooks.
Well, that's very charitable of Kraut, isn't it? Although I agree that using school textbooks might not be the ideal methodology, I think that Kraut should keep in mind that school textbooks are actually written by experts in the areas of study which they cover. I suspect that biology textbooks are actually authored by biologists, so perhaps we should consider the purpose they serve in the context of the study we are considering, before dismissing their use out of hand. But that's a minor point. There is another point which is not so minor, and that is we have a little mystery at hand. Let's back up a little, as I think we might have missed something important in all the excitement. As we can see, he quickly scrolled through the university webpage, but the interesting thing is, this picture at the bottom is none other than Dr. Morning, the author of the article he claims he could not find. So let's help Kraut with his research and do a little detective work and view her university page. As we can see, Dr. Morning is Assistant Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology at New York University. Dr. Morning is a sociologist and demographer whose research focuses on race. In particular, she has studied racial and ethnic classification on censuses worldwide, as well as beliefs about racial differences in the United States and Western Europe. Much of her work examines how contemporary science, particularly in the field of genetics, influences how we conceptualize race. So her area of expertise does seem relevant to the conversation, but Kraut simply dismisses Dr. Morning as a sociologist, without indicating her primary area of expertise. But perhaps more interesting to our meditations is the section further down the page, where we see an entry titled Reconstructing Race in Science and Society, Biology Textbooks, 1952-2002, with a link to the full article. Well, what are we to make of this? Before we move on to the next section, it's important to note that Kraut does not indicate which kind of neurologist is to impress us with his learned opinion, but I suspect from the content of his argument that he specializes in neurology rather than neurobiology or neuroscience. I might be wrong in this, but anyway, take it away, Herr Doctor.
hypothesis should have done. I asked a neurologist why the medical descriptions of race have risen in biology and medical textbooks. And the answer is all rather simple, because it has all to do with the word medical.
There are good scientific reasons to use the term race or ethnicity in a medical context. It is actually pretty simple, but not for the reasons some of you might think. Yes, it has to do with different geographical locations, which led to different selection pressures on different continental populations. Let me illustrate this with an often used example.
He goes on to use sickle cell anemia to explain environmentally driven evolutionary adaptation. But the important phrase he used in his introduction to this section is that, and I quote, "There are good scientific reasons to use the terms race or ethnicity in a medical context." And indeed there are. So let's skip the rather tedious explanation of sickle cell anemia and get to the meat of the argument the good doctor sets before us. Of particular interest will be the caveat he introduces towards the end of this section.
And overall vulnerability to diseases, the causation is pretty clear, most of the time. Since different continental populations developed under different environmental factors, doctors and other medical staff have to be aware of this fact in order to provide effective medicine and treatment. It is actually pretty similar to the difference between men and women. Not all treatments show the same effectiveness if you use them on women or men. But of course, there's a really big caveat to all of this. Let's have a look at the publication, population profiling and public health risk. When and how should we use a race or ethnicity? Which illustrates perfectly why it is not that easy or even warranted to use race or ethnicity as a criterion to categorize people, even in the context of medical treatment. The author George Allison writes, "Setting aside for a moment the debate about what race or ethnicity means, be this a biological, social or political aspect of group identity, it is still pertinent to ask whether it can be reliably measured. At first sight, race or ethnicity appears inherently unreliable. There is little consensus on what race or ethnicity means or on how it should be defined and measured. First of all, race or ethnicity is a construct and not something that can be easily or reliably measured with objective criteria. There are no clear definitions on where racial boundaries start and end. Therefore, even in medical context, self-assigned race or ethnicity is the most commonly used technique in order to measure this trait. If there's a need to explain to you why this, and by this I mean using this as an argument for the existence or reality of race, puts you in a pretty bad position, there is actually no point in trying to save you intellectually.
Stop it. Get some help.
But let's carry on. It is more difficult to set aside the contested meaning of race or ethnicity to discuss its reliability as a proxy for other variables. In part, this is because, as we have already seen, there is no universally accepted definition of the term. But this is also because race or ethnicity is associated with a wide range of biological and social variables, and because its use as a measure and a proxy for either can lead to stereotyping and discrimination. So,
we shall pause here because someone is going off script, or at least did not get the Kraut memo. The paper that the neurologist references is published by Rutledge, which specialises in social science publications. Kraut has already dismissed sociology as being in any way relevant to our conversation in his introduction to the topic. So what the hell's going on here? The passage in this paper that is highlighted ends with a line, and I quote, "Because its use as a measure and a proxy for either can lead to stereotyping and discrimination." So this is not referring to biology or clinical utility, but rather to potentially adverse social and political outcomes. So we seem to be conflating two very different uses of the word race. Kraut is attempting to hold to biology in support of his position, but the neurologist is presenting a primarily sociological position. These two positions are somewhat contradictory. At this point, we should perhaps consider the term race itself. The term is not confined to humans, but is used also as a category across species. Chimpanzees, for instance, can be defined by race, but its application in relation to the human population is contentious, and not all biologists would agree with its use, but many do, and when they do use it, it is almost always used as a synonym for subspecies. A typical definition is offered by the biologist Professor Dunn. He describes races as biological subgroups within a single species. He goes on to say that in Homo sapiens, in which the similar heredity which the whole group has in common far outweighs the relative and minor ways in which the subgroups differ. So in biology we have race, subspecies. In sociology, on the other hand, it is common to see the term race used as a synonym for ethnicity, and ethnicity is a sociological term. So we have to be careful not to equivocate between the two different meanings. If we are discussing biology, then race should be taken to mean subspecies or subgroup, and not ethnicity, which is another matter. The reason I think it's important to make this distinction will become obvious when Kraut develops his argument later. So let's now turn to Kraut's own understanding of the science, because sadly, this is where things start to go downhill rather rapidly.
Categories by Chinese scientists and defines racial categories as, quote, racial categories as defined here include traditional racial taxa, Australoids, self-contradictory geographical descriptions, Australian Europeans, ethnical identifications inferred by the researcher by just looking at the people, and any groupings in terms of supposed historical origin rather than observable characteristics. Now, let's make this very clear. These are not biological categories. These are not biologists categorizing people on the basis of there being a supposed scientific theory of race within biology. These are all sociological categories. Traditional racial taxa, sociological. Self-contradictory geographical descriptions, such as Australian, European, that's sociological, unless you can prove to me that there is a biological category of Australians. Ethnic identifications inferred by the researcher by just looking at people groupings in terms of supposed historical origins rather than observable characteristic. Yeah, that's also sociological. None of these are in any way biology. None of these are in any way natural science. This entire first segment of the article, titled Majority View, besides being a lame appeal to authority, is nothing but something that we have found in the last video too. Sociological determinism masquerading as biological determinism.
We pause here because this is interesting, isn't it? Australoid is an extremely wide category that is not confined to Aboriginal Australians. It covers a large geographical area which from memory includes Malaysia, for instance. Australoid is a biological categorization, the use of which may be contested or challenged, but it is not sociological. There are physiological differences which would include or exclude humans from this category. Also, Australia does seem to have more than a few Australians who are of European heritage, as well as native or Aboriginal population. I would imagine that it is the Aboriginal population that would qualify for Kraut's biological Australians. Is this a contentious statement to make? Well, I don't think so. It's simply an observable fact. The obvious response to "it's all a social construction" argument is this. If true, how is it that a forensic scientist can correctly identify a European from an African by the structure of the skeletal remains of each? If, as suggested, race is simply a construction and in reality there is no fundamental difference between the two, how is this forensic determination possible if that argument is sound?
Next part of this piece, heterozygosity. Heterozygosity, or gene diversity, is a measurement of genetic variation within natural population groups. A gene is a segment of your DNA responsible for various parts of who you are. Take, for example, your hair color, which is as it is because of a specific gene. That gene contains the information similar to a building plan that creates the proteins responsible for your hair color. And the variation of these genes amongst the population group are what causes varying hair colors within a population group. These variations are called alleles. With hair color, the alleles would be the different genes for the different hair colors of brown, blonde, red, and other. Heterozygosity measures how many of these alleles exist within a population group. High heterozygosity means more alleles, hence more genetic variation. Low heterozygosity means less alleles, hence less genetic variation. And heterozygosity can tell you a great deal about not only the structure but also the history of the measured population. For example, very low heterozygosity of cheetahs shows the severe effect of small population sizes, bottlenecks that reduce the amount of genetic variation relative to what we would usually expect to be found in comparable mammals. Now, with the term explained, let us dive into what the alternative hypothesis has to say about it. Quote, one popular argument used against the possibility of races in humans is that humans are 99.9% the same. This claim was first made by Craig Venter in 2000. However, in 2007, Venter did another analysis that showed that only 99.5% of human chromosomal DNA is the same between two random individuals. Despite this, it is still a popular talking point amongst race deniers that humans are 99.9% the same. Now, quote, humans are the same is a rather weird way of saying it. It doesn't really make much sense. So I will just quote directly from the article that the alternative hypothesis uses here as a source. Quote, if you ask what percentage of your genes is reflected in your external appearance, the basis by which we talk about race, the answer seems to be in the range of 0.01%, said Dr. Harold P. Freeman, the chief executive president and director of surgery at North General Hospital in Manhattan, who has studied the issue of biology and race. This is a very, very minimal reflection of your genetic makeup. The criteria that people use for race are based entirely on external features that we are programmed to recognize, he said. And the reason why we're programmed to recognize them is that it's vitally important to our species that each of us be able to distinguish one individual from the next. Our whole social structure is based on visual cues, and we've been programmed to recognize them and to recognize individuals. So in essence, the source alternative hypothesis gives doesn't say we are the same, but that the genes responsible for what we perceive as race are merely 0.01% of our genetic makeup. That is not the same. But now in relation to that,
I'm going to go into pedant mode here because there were a few basic errors in Kraut's genetic explanation. We have genotype and phenotype. Genotype refers to the genes, and phenotype is the physical expression of these genes. Hair colour is the phenotypical expression of certain genes. If more than a single gene is responsible for a phenotype, such as hair colour, then the group or family of genes are called an allele. Hair colour is not the product of single genes, but rather a combination of dominant, semi-dominant and recessive genes. These genes are the alleles, not the hair colour, which itself is the phenotype. Sorry about that, but I thought it best to clarify what Kraut was attempting to explain. We also need to consider several issues relating to percentages before we move on. Kraut talks about 0.01% difference in relation to the genetics. What does this mean in reality? Well, it's difficult to be precise in this area because the percentages themselves can vary between scientific papers. The percentage he quotes seems extremely low, but let's run with them because it makes little difference to the issue at hand. If we assume the differences between proposed racial groups are in the order of 0.01%, then the difference between the sexes would be around 0.05 or 0.1%. And even though humans are not highly dimorphic, there does seem to be two distinct populations within the human species. 0.1% seems trivial, but consider this. When the University of Leicester printed the whole of the human genome, it took 130 volumes, which they estimated would take a normal reader 95 years to read. There are 3.2 billion base pairs recorded in these volumes. 0.5% of 3.2 billion is not insignificant, as one first supposes. If we compare human to chimpanzee or bonobo, we find a difference of about 1.2%. The DNA difference between gorillas and humans is about 1.6%. Such is the influence of these supposedly insignificant percentages.
I'm going to take my sweet long time explaining to you in detail how unbelievably stupid what he has done here is. These stats have namely absolutely nothing to do with each other. Sweet fuck all. Heterozygosity, which is genetic variation within one species, has absolutely no correlation, absolutely nothing to do with supposed frequency of subspecies. What the alternative hypothesis is doing here would be called a spurious relationship. To explain what a spurious relationship is, I will give its most famous example. Robert Matthews' storks deliver babies. Within this paper, which is intended to show what a spurious relationship is, Robert Matthews collected the data of stork populations from from various nations, as well as data of the human birth rates of these nations. He puts these data sets next to each other and showed that they correlate mathematically, meaning in correspondence to rising birth rates in countries, you will also find rising stork populations within those countries, and can mockingly proclaim that rising stork populations are responsible for rising birth rates amongst people. This, of course, is nonsense, because even though there is a mathematical correlation, there's absolutely no correlation in reality. A nation's birth rates are not dependent upon the nation's stork population. The correlation, as can be seen in the graph of the two data sets, is purely mathematical with no basis in reality. And this is what the alternative hypothesis would be doing here. Yes, I'm saying would be, because he's failing. He takes two sets of data which have absolutely nothing to do with each other and then pretends that they are in biological correlation, where in actual reality they are absolutely not. The number of subspecies is not dependent upon the genetic diversity of a species. There's absolutely no empirical data whatsoever that would prove that genetic diversity causes an increase of subspecies. There are 0 scientific biology papers showing such a correlation. There's absolutely no foundation for it besides a supposed mathematical correlation. So in essence, alternative hypothesis pulled all of this out of his arse.
Well, that was quite a claim. So the question is, might there be a link or correlation between heterozygosity and the prevalence of subspecies? Or is there absolutely no link between the two? Kraut concedes that high levels of genetic diversity allows more adaptation within a particular population. But here's an interesting point to consider. What happens if we go the other way and lower heterozygosity? This can either lead to extinction or, surprisingly, it might also drive accelerated adaptation. This leads us to a question. Are there scientific papers that might be used in support of this hypothesis? Well, there is one paper that instantly springs to mind. You might have heard about it. It's called The Origin of Species. Its author is Charles Darwin. If you think about what inspired Darwin to formulate his theory of evolution, in large part, it was his observation of the finch population on the Galapagos Islands. Now, this population is thought to have originated from either a single female or a single breeding pair of finches. Of course, Darwin knew nothing of genetics, but I think most viewers would immediately recognise that in this instance, heterozygosity would be minimal. We have a single breeding pair at most. Yet Darwin observed many apparently different species of finch on the island. So this is an example of low heterozygosity leading to high rates of hybridization within a finch population. There are also more modern examples. For instance, researchers have found high rates of hybridization within yeast cultures when heterozygosity is low. So these are two counterexamples to Kraut's assertion, one from classical biology, Darwin's Finches, and the other from evolutionary research in microbiology, that is, the observation that loss of heterozygosity drives adaptation in yeast cultures. There have been several human near-extinction events. It seems that 1.2 million years ago, things weren't looking good. Population had been reduced to an estimated 18,000 individuals, and the entire native population of the Americas are thought to be the descendants of only 70 individuals who had crossed the land bridge between Asia and North America. These population changes inevitably resulted in extremely low heterozygosity, and genetic drift changed the distribution of alleles within these populations. So my suggestion is that there is a correlation between heterozygosity and the prevalence of subspecies. At high levels, it results in a more adaptive, robust population, but in extremely low levels, it can also drive rapid change. What Kraut has done here is to take a badly presented argument and assume that there is no scientific basis for it merely on the merits of the argument itself.
Human races are subspecies. This is something that I have frequently heard from by the alt-right, and it is mainly a claim that underlines one thing, that the alt-right does not understand evolution. The animal that the alt-right really likes to take for their argument are the Sumatran tigers. At least that's what I heard from Tara McCarthy, presumably after she googled subspecies, came to the Wikipedia article on subspecies and found the Sumatran tiger listed there as an example within the English Wikipedia article, as an example example of a subspecies? Well, I don't need such a special example to prove them wrong. I just need the donkey, a subspecies of the horse. Why is that such a good example? Because you can famously mate a donkey with a horse and the result is the mule. The mule is a F1 hybrid, the offspring of two different subspecies, but far more relevant to us because it is well known that the mule cannot produce offspring. If human races were different subspecies, they wouldn't be able to breed. If human races were subspecies and were to have sex and produce offspring, there is a possibility of there being offspring, yet that offspring would be sterile, impotent, and incapable of producing viable offspring, just like the mule.
Now, this is a simple schoolboy error. The fact that mules are sterile should have indicated to Kraut that in fact donkeys and horses are different species, not subspecies. Donkeys are not horses, and neither are zebra. They all share a common ancestor. I find it difficult to know how he made this error because the diagram he used in the video appears to show this is the case. It's the equivalent of claiming that bonobos are a subspecies of human. It's a pretty basic mistake, and I'm surprised it made it into the video. Unfortunately, the rest of his argument now rests on this misapprehension of the nature of species and subspecies. In effect, he argues against the idiocy of his own mistake, which is somewhat unedifying.
If we start categorizing on the basis of random criteria, and they are called random because of overlapping potential, then we end up with no clear rules and a mess. If we start categorizing population groups, for example within biology, by their height, we start getting statistical overlaps between population groups, rendering that categorization pointless. If biology starts categorizing people on the basis of strength, we start to get statistical overlap with other population groups, again rendering that categorization pointless. If we start categorizing people into biological subcategories on the basis of their intelligence, we end up with a statistical overlap, hence again rendering such a category as useless. And this is why sexual reproduction is the criteria by which biologists categorize species, because there is absolutely zero statistical or other overlap. You either produce viable offspring or you are an evolutionary dead end. We have not yet discussed the alt-right's talking points on race and IQ, but within this context it serves a great purpose as an example. If you categorize on the basis of intelligence per racial group every single black person with above average IQ, this proves your criteria of categorization along the lines of intelligence, because it would, according to that criteria, suddenly turn an above average intelligence black person into a white person.
His brain is gone.
Now, this is where it gets very silly. If, as suggested, the genetic difference between males and females is about 1.5%, then you would reasonably expect overlap between the two populations in almost every trait. In some traits, the population averages would align, but in many it would be bimodal. I have no idea why Kraut has come to this inexplicable conclusion that somehow he believes such distributions are pointless, that if you have an overlap between population, then this renders the category as useless. A female of above average height is still female. Such distribution patterns are to be expected given the nature of the biology, which Kraut seems wholly ignorant of, and this ignorance is painfully demonstrated by his presentation of this palpable nonsense. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.